He doesn't really like NATO very much, as you know. He has some admiration for the way that strong men are able to operate without the restraints of democracy. Again, might seem baffling, but apparently that is the case. And he really wants to bring this war to an end. He's, as he sees it, spent nearly 100 days trying to get a peace agreement. It doesn't seem that there's one in the offing. So he's saying the US essentially is ready to move on.
President Trump has been speaking in the last hour. He says he hopes the US can make a trade deal with China.
I get along very well with President Xi, and I hope we can make a deal. Otherwise, we'll set a price, and hopefully they'll come here and they'll contribute. And if they don't, that's okay.
I don't think he gets on very well with President Xi. Do you? It's interesting to hear him put it in these terms, isn't it? He's also teased the prospect of a deal between Ukraine and Russia. Forgive me, my computer's just crashed. On trade talks, he also said that he hopes the US can strike a deal with China. Laura Trevelyan is a journalist and ex-BBC anchor. Hi there, Laura.
Hi, Ollie. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Yes, we're just drifting into Ron Burgundy mode there. I was reading a load of words that didn't make any sense. Completely my fault. What do you make of Trump pressuring Zelensky, though? I mean, this is the story that every newspaper's running with over here in the morning. Sort of outrage, really, of kind of Mark II of the Oval Office.
Well, the US has made it very clear that it's willing to move on, as it says, from the current situation if there isn't agreement on the basis of the peace deal, which the Americans have endorsed, which basically would be a freeze along the current territorial situation in Ukraine. Now, that may be shocking to listeners in Britain, that this is a complete volte-face, of course, from the position of the Biden administration. But the Trump administration seems to be very much on Russia's side in this one. Remember, of course, that many supporters of President Trump see Ukraine as being a drain on the US finances, that the billions of dollars worth of military and humanitarian aid that have gone to Ukraine have created, in a sense, a kind of a welfare state. So that's where the president is coming from. He wants to end this war. He promised he would do so as soon as he took office. He hasn't. So the Americans are preparing, in effect, to end US military aid to Ukraine, saying it's essentially a European issue.
Yeah, let's have a listen to the clip, actually, that I was trying to read into a minute ago. Here it is. This is the US president putting pressure on Zelensky today.
But I just hope he gets this thing solved, because we're losing about, think of this, 5,000. I was saying 2,500, and everyone was telling me that's low. 5,000 soldiers are being killed every week, approximately. Think of that. Every week, 5,000 soldiers. But let's say from 3,000 to 5,000 are being killed. They're Russian and Ukrainian. They're not Americans, but they're Russian, but they're people. And they're humans. They're human beings. They have families. They wave goodbye to their son, and then they get a call that the son's no longer there. It's a vicious war. And if I can help solve it, you know, we're not losing our soldiers, but we're losing soldiers, a lot of people.
Oh, it's extraordinary, isn't it, Laura? As you were saying, you know, from a British perspective, hearing that, you know, who's killing those people? It's President Putin as well, isn't it? It's a war between two entities, and it's a war that Russia started. It's so bizarre to many people listening to this. I guess you can understand why, from his perspective, with his policy, he would criticize Zelensky for saying that he wouldn't give up Crimea, for example, but to not criticize Putin at all, that's the bizarre bit, isn't it? There's no harsh words for the man who started the war.
Well, you know, remember that in his first term, President Trump all along said that President Putin hadn't tried to interfere in the 2016 US election, despite findings by US intelligence agencies that he almost certainly had. So President Trump always defends, in a way, those people that he perceives to be on his side. And he has long felt an affinity with President Putin. He's also long sided with Russia on the question of Ukraine, describing it as basically part of Russia. So he just has a completely different worldview, a completely different strategic view. He doesn't really like NATO very much, as you know. He has some admiration for the way that strong men are able to operate without the restraints of democracy. Again, might seem baffling, but apparently that is the case. And he really wants to bring this war to an end. He's, as he sees it, spent nearly 100 days trying to get a peace agreement. It doesn't seem that there's one in the offing. So he's saying the US essentially is ready to move on, and thus trying to put pressure on President Zelensky. I think the question really, and Ollie, you'll be better placed to answer this, is what will the Europeans do if the US does stop all military aid to Ukraine?
It feels almost like he's pushing us to come up with an answer to that question, doesn't it? Let's move on ourselves, actually, though, to this other story about the trade tariffs. You know, as important, more important for Americans, a trade deal with China. Is he any closer to striking a trade deal with China tonight, in your assessment?
Well, it's a great question. Top Chinese finance officials are in Washington for the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. Is it possible that they could drop by the White House while they're in Washington? We don't know. But the fact is, the stock markets slumped at the beginning when President Trump announced those tariffs of 145% on Chinese imports to the United States, not to mention the others all around the world. Now, he suspended most of those reciprocal tariffs, but not the ones on China. Markets have been freaking out, but the last 2 days, markets have rallied here in the United States. One, because Mr. Trump said that he wasn't about to fire the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, for not lowering interest rates. And secondly, because President Trump is signaling that the tariffs on China are going to come down substantially. And his Treasury Secretary said the current tariff levels between China and the US were unsustainable. So it does look like, once again, spooked by the market reaction, the Trump administration wants to try to soften the situation with Chinese tariffs. But also the White House is saying President Trump isn't unilaterally going to reduce those massive tariffs on Chinese imports. So it's a little unclear what that means. The Chinese have signaled a willingness to negotiate from Beijing, but right now they seem to have President Trump right where they want him. But of course, these tariffs are hurting the Chinese as well. And we're hearing anecdotal reports of a huge drop in the amount of Chinese goods coming to the United States. And on Monday, President Trump met with major retailers like Walmart and Home Depot. The CEOs went to the White House. And some of the reporting from that meeting is CEOs told him that because of these tariffs, that prices are going to go up and shelves may be empty in some of their stores.
And I suppose his approach to the way he does all politics is not to admit that he miscalculated anything. He's going to say, isn't he, that this was part of a genius plan. He made China think that he was going to impose these tariffs, but he wasn't, and he's got a great deal. You can't really argue against that, can you? Because you don't know what was going to happen otherwise.
Well, Mr. Trump always talks about the art of the deal. That's who he is. That's really his moniker. It's his motif, and it enables his supporters to stay, if he seems to be backtracking in any moment, that was part of the plan all along, and it's all just the art of the deal. But I do have to say that markets here in the United States have been incredibly skeptical about the president's economic policy. And now what you're seeing is that the general public, in the latest Reuters poll, 37% of people, only 37% actually approve of President Trump's handling of the economy. Three-quarters of Americans are worried that there could be a recession. People elected President Trump, according to the exit polls, because they wanted the economy to be better handled. They wanted prices to come down. Instead, everybody here is worried that tariffs are going to push up prices and that will fuel further inflation. So President Trump has boxed himself in rather. And the worry that some financial analysts have is that even if the tariffs are unwound, some damage has already been done.
All right. Laura Trevelyan, journalist and ex-BBC anchor who's been covering the US since 2004. Thanks very much for joining me here on Times Radio.